Hi, everyone. Welcome to our next installment of the Gikanu-Imagwin webinar series. My name is Erica Feinstone, and I'm a settler of Polish and Romanian descent. And I'm also a PhD candidate in social cultural anthropology at the University of Toronto, and an instructor in Indigenous studies at the University of Victoria. And in another one of my roles, I'm a project manager for Jean-Paul Ristoul, Dr. Jean-Paul Ristoul, who is the chair of Indigenous education at University of Victoria. So I'm really excited to welcome you all here today for the Building Relationships in Indigenous Education webinar. And we have a few great guests who will serve as panelists today. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but I just wanted to open up the series today. And, oh, hi, Ryan.
Hi there.
Our faces are going to be popping up at various points, but I'll just be basically serving as the moderator today. So I'll be fielding questions from you. And hi, Jean-Paul.
Hello. Hello.
And yeah, we do want to encourage audience participation today, though we have built in a couple of questions of our own just to keep things flowing. But yes, for participants who you see the chat window that's on your Demio screen there. So if you just want to be inputting your questions, I'll be keeping an eye on that. And I'll be sending the questions over to our panelists so that they can be answering your questions too.
Erica, it's Angela here. I know you can hear me, but I just found out, because this is the first time we've done a panel, we can only have 3 cameras on at the same time. So I'm just going to be jumping in from the faceless ether.
Oh, okay. Would you like to take my place, because I can be more of a background person? That seems like a better idea.
You do your thing. You're doing great.
Okay. Okay. So I'll just, okay, so we're going to go through the slides here. I do have to make a small note of thanks to our sponsors, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, who have helped make this possible today. And on that note, we actually do have a survey that will pop up at the end that we'd really appreciate your participation in. It helps us understand how to do better work in our various SSHRC-funded projects. And it's always just, it's nice to hear from everyone, to hear feedback about how we're doing. So we have a bit of an agenda today. We'll do our introductions. We'll make space for each of our panelists to introduce themselves. Then we have some prepared questions. We'll do our Q&A. And then we'll just have some final wrap-up notes at the end, and then the survey will pop up, so we hope you all participate. So I'll let each of the panelists do their own acknowledgement, because I think we find ourselves on different lands today. So Ryan, would you like to start by introducing yourself?
Oh, sure. So my full name's Ryan Neepin. I'm a member of Fox Lake Cree Nation. I am currently teaching grade 7 in a major Ontario board, and I'm also a PhD student at Boise.
And that's all.
Great. Thanks.
Bonjour, Jean-Paul Ristoul, Nidishnikaz, Wajash Nadodem, Okigadak Nasing Nadonji, Nishna Bay and Dao, Oimitagoshi and Dao. I come to you today from the unceded territories of Lekwungen and Senchothan speaking peoples, where it's a great privilege to do this work on these territories. And yeah, I'm just so humbled every day when I get to do this work here. And Erica's usually here with me too, so I know that we both feel very honored to be able to work in this place.
Definitely. Angela, would you like to be introducing yourself as a faceless person?
I thank you both. Danny and I are handling some technical difficulties on this end, so I didn't hear everything from the introduction, so sorry if I repeat anything, but I'm also coming to folks from Toronto, My name's Dr. Angela Nardozzi. I'm a settler and guest on Turtle Island. My family comes here from Italy, and I have been so honored to be doing this webinar series with John Paul and Erica this year. I'm a consultant and coach with Listen and Learn, and I'm really excited to be here today. Now, one of the things I just want to address before we move on is there's a beeping happening sometimes, and I don't know,
do you know what?
It may be happening.
There are men right outside my window.
Hashtag men at work.
Fixing the bricks. This was supposed to be over at 6 o'clock. It's now 7. And I hope that they're going to go.
It's all good,
so I
right?
apologize for that. Is it really awful? I could keep my my speaker off.
Yeah, that might be helpful. But yeah, noise bylaws in Toronto. Who needs them?
Yeah, it's looking in at me now. So
you complained about him too loudly.
I'm gonna, and the windows are shut, both pins. So that's how loud it is. I'll keep this off and let some speakers.
We can all keep our mics off while another person's talking too.
Sure. Okay, so I'm going.
All right, Erica, take us away.
All right. Well, I'll go through this, just a list of topics for today. And if participants, if you're seeing anything on there and you're thinking to yourself, ooh, I have a question that goes with that theme, then please do feel free to send us a question in the chat field there. So we'll be talking about meeting the needs of Indigenous students, building relationships with Indigenous families, collaborating with colleagues, seeking out partnerships, and just finding a general balance between what non-Indigenous educators can pursue on their own and when it's actually more appropriate to seek out Indigenous collaborators. And lastly, just distinctions between appreciation of Indigenous cultures or teachings and the appropriation of Indigenous culture and teachings. And there's a really fine line there. I think that's been an ongoing thread in our webinar so far. So looking forward to continuing that dialogue. So I'll start with the first question, which is, can you tell us just a little bit about your experience working with Indigenous students? And in particular, what kind of learnings can you share with us from that work?
Yeah. Ryan, do you want to start on that? I know that you have done some really good work in Toronto recently.
Well, I've been working with Indigenous students in several capacities over the last couple of years. I think for me, it sort of harkens back to my own experience as an Indigenous student. So it is knowing that in many of our classrooms historically, and I would argue probably still today, we are not represented well. And many of our histories, many of our stories, ways of knowing are not represented in the classroom. And so what I try to do is bring those knowledges in, bring those understandings in, not only in the content, but in the ways in which I'm working with the students. That was really missing for me in my elementary and secondary education. And, you know, I think I've told you the story before, Angela, but it's a story I often tell. Is I had to kind of go to university to find out things about my own people's histories. So recognizing that, those are the kinds of things I'm trying to bring to my students.
And I think that story is something that I've heard from a lot of folks. I don't know if I can add to what you're saying. I think what you said is complete in itself, but I just wanted to jump in from my perspective as like a non-Indigenous person. And my first work with Indigenous folks was up in sort of middle Ontario, near the Kenora area, Treaty 3 area, working with First Nations young people as part of the Frontier College literacy camps, which I know a lot of people have now had experience with. And one of the things I think that I realized while doing that work as a settler educator was I was quickly confronted with all of the implicit biases that I had. And it was shocking to me because, you know, I considered myself, I'm a good person. I've thought about these things, you know. It was shocking to me how things would come up, and I would often see people, the young people and their families in the deficit model. And so I think for me, being very vigilant and about my own thought process and behaviors, and getting really honest with myself and going beyond this idea of I'm a good person, you know, I'm an anti-racist educator, and just being really real, just being really, really, really grappling with what's coming up for me here, and turning around and listening more rather than sort of sitting in my, well, my way is the right way, which I think has been so reinforced because I'm so steeped in colonial society. So I just wanted to put that out there as from my perspective.
That experience too. I remember you sharing that with me before. In my experiences with Indigenous students, that's mostly been at the post-secondary level. But I see the same kinds of issues in terms of representation that Ryan was mentioning. Whether you actually see yourself represented in the content in the classroom, in the way that things are made up, and whether or not when you are discussed like as a topic or whatever, in what ways are those things addressed? So I can speak a little bit to my own experience as an Indigenous student too. In high school, say, if you heard anything at all about Indigenous people, it was often very stereotypical, very simplistic, token. We talked once before at an OISE event about how historical and historicized Indigenous experiences often were. So not really seeing yourself as a contemporary, relevant part of things going on in Canadian society. So we might be talked about historically as allies or enemies to European actions. And then after War of 1812, you don't really hear from us much. Treaties were not talked about. What else was left out? So many things. But then maybe we might make an appearance at Oka, and then Meech Lake Accord. And it's usually a statement or two, and you don't really hear the full story about why might Elijah Harper have said no? What were the reasons behind it? Anyway, get off my high horse for a sec, but also say that some of the things that I also heard about from Indigenous students is that they're often expected to assimilate into the system that we have, as opposed to the system trying to come closer to Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous ways of articulating things, which if you have seen the way that those things are done, and I had a chance when I was at the First Nations School of Toronto, and I saw Jackie's classroom when she was still teaching, and she had organized everything around the seasons. And so the students kind of moved through the seasons of the year and learned things related to what season are we in. It was just seemed like something that would be kind of mnemonic, but also made sense to people. And it was a way of relating to things in a whole other way. Instead of the compartmentalization of subjects and disciplines, they were learning things all together and holistically. And so it's a different approach when you try and bring Indigenous knowledge or come to Indigenous knowledge as opposed to force fitting it into a pre-assigned or presumed kind of sense of how things ought to be. And I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much. So there was another sub question under that same topic, and it's what can educators do to advocate for their Indigenous students? And I think you did touch on that, but is there anything in specific that you could say about how to be an advocate for students of yours? And feel free to raise your hand if you're wondering, you don't want to talk over each other. Jean-Paul.
I was taking a moment there.
Yeah.
In terms of advocating for students, one of the things we've had to do here at UVic, and I don't want to say we're that successful at it really, still working out how to do it, is there's kind of a ceremonial season, like a cultural season, where students are expected to participate in their community's big house. And so when they're doing that work, they come to school either exhausted, tired, or sometimes bored, because it's such a different way of being with each other than what they're doing in the evenings and the mornings and so forth. But we're trying to figure out, can we advocate for those students by having instructors understand that they're trying to balance and manage all of these different responsibilities, and so school comes lower down on the priority list. Can we schedule things at a different time? Can we provide accommodations for assignments and when they're due, and those kinds of things? And we're still working that out, and it's not easy even for us. So I can only imagine for a K-12 school how difficult it would be for them to find ways to change and accommodate.
Yeah, I'll add on to what you're saying, John Paul. Thanks for sharing that about the context you're in. I can imagine, again, on your side of Turtle Island, things are a little bit different, right? Like, I don't know. I mean, I know there's ceremonial calendars here that different nations follow and people participate in, but it sounds like there's more of a critical mass happening over there. So interesting stuff. I think yeah, please.
And about that, so one of the naive things I brought from the East when I came out here was a sense of our calendars in Ontario, and especially thinking about like the Haudenosaunee people. And I was thinking, well, is it kind of like midwinter ceremonies where, there's going to be a break for a couple of weeks, and but no, it's like October to March. It's huge here, so it's been a really I'm still learning about that.
That's so neat, and speaks to the fact that we need to get to know exactly where we are, right? And the local piece of it. I just wanted to jump in and say, in the Toronto context, I know that there are a few schools where there's, I keep using this word, like a critical mass of like Indigenous families, but I know that there's also Indigenous families across the GTA and across, the context that I work in Southern Ontario. And I think, and this kind of bleeds into our next topic, but ensuring that Indigenous parents are at the table, right? Thinking about who's at the parent-teacher committee meetings, who's able to access them, and how can we make them more accessible? Like, I've worked with principals who've talked about ensuring that tokens are provided. Something as simple as that, making sure people who have accessibility issues get a taxi if they want to be there. It's not always in the budget, but I know people who've done it. They've made it work. And for me, ensuring that we make room for the voices of their caregivers and guardians and parents is an essential part of it. Because again, as a non-Indigenous person, I can advocate for my students based on what I see, but the people who are with them on the daily basis and are throughout the years, they know them the best. So I always keep that in mind.
Also the Toronto city context, but also, in elementary schools, I've really been able to witness at least an administrator do an amazing job um, in her school, where she has been able to bring language speakers to her Indigenous students as an option for that second language instruction. So it doesn't necessarily have to be French, which is the typical selection, but instead they can learn, in these students' cases, Anishinaabe Moan. She has also brought in culture teachers for additional instruction, and also social support. And so those students are able to make a drum, go out and feast that drum, learn the songs, and they're able to do that with a community member and a mentor. So that kind of advocacy is really amazing. But of course, that when that comes down from an administrator that's sort of school-wide, inside the classroom, I think we can still attempt to make those, to advocate for those kinds of things. But what I think that might look like is reaching out to our administrators, perhaps using that school as an example or other examples that we're aware of, but also reaching out to those central spots, so the Indigenous education offices, which should exist, at least in Ontario and all of those school boards.
Thank you. Okay, so maybe we'll move on to the next question. Just a reminder to participants that at any point, if you want to be sharing questions, we're going to be checking the chat. So please do feel free to send those in. And if not, we'll just be carrying on with our own set of questions that we thought up. So we'll move on to the next topic, which is building relationships with Indigenous families. And the question is building relationships with Indigenous families in your educational community unique to other relationships that you form?
I just wanted to follow up on something from the last thing about parents, working with parents, and I guess this works well with building relationships with families. I think the school system lately has been set up in such a way that teachers will say things are the parents' fault, and then parents will think things are the teacher's fault. And instead of working together to figure out what's our best pathway for our student here, our child here, such as it may be, they may be much older, instead of working together, it's like they're pitted against each other. And I think working to figure out how we get away from that is important. And I think also many Indigenous parents and families are survivors of residential schooling, or are not that far away from that experience. So they've learned a lot of things around institutions that become triggering. So they don't want to enter schools, or they don't want to be argumentative or talk back to authority figures and that sort of thing. So anything that can be done to break down those kinds of barriers is important. So if you can meet at a safer space, something that's kind of neutral, so you don't seem to be going into their home, say, or requiring them to come to the school, but rather saying, well, I'll meet you for coffee somewhere, you choose. That can be a place where things can be talked about. And also reaching out to parents and families when there's not a problem is really important, because too often teachers try to make a connection when there's an issue. And so it kind of sets up that idea that you only come out when there's an issue, or you're only worthy of being talked to when there's a problem, or that the student is a problem. But to just have the lines open and be able to communicate about things, good and bad, when there's nothing going on even, I think sets up the relationship to be a much more positive one. Easier said than done, though.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jean-Paul.
I just want to say, I really agree with what you're saying, Jean-Paul. And I think what I hear from teacher candidates that I work with a lot, and educators that I work with, is because I think what you're saying is best practice. Well, best practices, I hate that phrase, but it's good. It's good practice, right, for any family that you're working with, right? Making those positive contacts and well, and I think there are particulars, like you're saying, meeting people in different places and recognizing the institutional, intergenerational trauma. What I hear from teachers sometimes is that for them, they feel intimidated because of it, right? Because if they're aware of the legacy of residential schools, they're so afraid of representing that like not being representing, but being the face of that that legacy. And yeah, they're intimidated about, how do I navigate this? And so for me, the message is like, it's good to know that might come up for folks, but to not be intimidated to the point of your own presence, to the point of not reaching out, right? Yeah, but it's a real concern. I hear it over and over again.
For both of you, firstly, in terms of meeting with the parents and not meeting when it's only an issue, I think that's absolutely crucial. The other thing is that when there are the attendance issues, or there are homework issues, things like this, and again, we're talking about not loving best practices, but often the practice is that you'll give those immediate phone calls home, or if the student isn't showing up, could even lead to a truancy officer or someone from the board supporting attendance. And I would urge teachers to think about that before those folks end up knocking on an Indigenous family's door because of the legacies that exist of residential schools and other traumatic events, right? I don't think that's the best case. I've witnessed this happen to some of our students in the area, and there's a lot of effects that happen within the family when people show up at the home unannounced or make these phone calls that are less than happy. I think it's really important to start to make those connections at the beginning of the year, so those lines of communications are open. It's good to know where those students are coming from and what family what those family dynamics might look like. A lot of assumptions are made, and I think when relationships are built, a lot of that is lessened.
Thank you. I don't know where I just disappeared to. We'll be figuring that out.
Danny's on the case.
There's so many mysteries, truly. But, as long as I have these intellectuals present, it should be fine. I'll move on to the next question. And this is still in the same topic, actually, but the question is, what are some ideas for folks who are nervous about reaching out? I assume this is reaching out to Indigenous families or Indigenous parents, given the historical impact of educational institutions on those same families.
Clearly, I wrote that question because I think I kind of was alluding to that in my last answer. So I'll pass it over if Ryan or John Paul want to jump in on that.
Oh, I'm back. Great. Okay.
Yeah.
Question. And I do think that it's really important to underline the importance of building that relationship and connection when it's early in the year and there aren't problems, and then that trust is built, like someone mentioned. And also just that idea too of, well, I lost the thought now. I was thinking about how important it is to show you care. That was what I saw on the side. So that notion of reaching out even in fear is better than not reaching out at all, because I think the biggest thing that Indigenous students respond to is knowing that someone cares. And that's something I've found in our research, is that when you say, name something a teacher did that mattered to you, and could be a really strict teacher or a firm teacher, but if they showed they cared and thought the person was capable. So the other thing was having high expectations, but you don't usually have those if you don't care too. But both of those things seem to matter a lot for Indigenous students to do well.
Mm-hmm. I mentioned a comment made by Tracy over here saying that she likes to go out to the band office and meet with the family, and often a translator attends too, so we can ensure transitions are meeting student and family needs. I just think that's so important and a really good piece of tangible advice for those who are working in communities where there is an available band office that they could go to and visit. It's always a really nice first step. Mm-hmm. So thank you, Tracy.
Yeah, Eric, I'm also seeing comments like from Stephen, who is sharing that he thinks that there is a huge lack of support for teachers who are teaching Indigenous students, and that he said one can often feel isolated or unsupported, whether it's an Indigenous or a non-Indigenous teacher. And other folks have talked about the importance of communication in staff teams, and are interested, in building community partnerships and those sorts of things. And yeah. I mean, of course, having a support system, reaching out to other folks, because I can imagine it does feel very isolating. Ryan, anything to add on that one?
Topic too. I think that when teachers are feeling unsupported, I think that's when collaboration really works. The school that I'm working at now had a wonderful program, but they've decided for the second term that we would do an Indigenous inquiry project school-wide. And I think when something like that comes top down from the administrators, and teachers are expected to deliver a program like that, where history is Indigenous focused, there are some huge questions for teachers. So as the Indigenous teacher at the school, I'm receiving a lot of questions. And what I'm beginning to realize is that teachers want to do it right, but they're afraid of where to start. And so a lot of the questions I'm being asked are those really basic questions like, is it appropriation if I read this story to my class, or do I have to bring in an Indigenous person to do this work? And I think that's where this collaboration, but also this question of support becomes a bit muddled. Because my response is, I don't think that you need to always bring in an Indigenous person to help you teach this work. But what I do think is important is to bring in Indigenous authored resources and facilitate that learning, and in a way that is co-learning along with your students. So what I've attempted to do is sort of invite other teachers in while I'm doing that, and some of that feedback is, well, it's easy for you. You're the Indigenous teacher, but my response is, well, listen, I'm Cree, and I know a little bit about some Cree teachings, not a whole lot about other nations. And so when I'm doing any other work that it requires work from other nations, that is learning for me, and that is a process for which I'm co-learning along with my students. So it's more of a facilitation.
Did you want to add, Jean-Paul? Thank you so much, Ryan. That's really important.
Really, really, really good advice. I was just thinking about how that kind of comes up, like, oh, I need the Indigenous voice to speak on this. And there are some things like that, but most things, it's a matter of diving in and having the confidence to do them, and do them in a spirit of co-inquiry, not unlike what Ryan's describing, where you're working together on learning. You're a learner too. So I think in this society, we are inundated with information. It's everywhere. And so the thing that we can best model for our students is how to learn something. And so if we're showing them how we learn about something we don't know a lot about, how do we engage with finding resources, and how do we assess those resources, they're learning something, a skill that's really valuable. And it's not just about being the authority who has all the answers and can just deliver that content. And I saw something in the chat there about, so much of the time this Indigenous education stuff is treated like content and not as pedagogy, or it's not about approach. And so how do we do that? How do we be inclusive and not just as content and lessons? And the thing I always like to promote to people is, from BC, there are these First Peoples principles of learning that are soon going to become, I think, a standard for all teachers in the province to learn. And as much as I see non-Indigenous people struggling with how to use those principles, it's really about your orientation, your attitude, your way of being with others, your way of making relationships. So I strongly encourage people to find those First Peoples principles of learning and figure out how to develop that orientation just in how you react and interrelate with the people in your classroom, with your colleagues, with your parents, with your admin staff, and so on. But it's just about how to relate. And when you kind of follow that path and that way of being, the other things kind of fall into place too. So that's a way to try and incorporate this stuff as more than just content.
Mm-hmm. John Paul, I just did a Google, and I think I found the PDF, and I slipped it into the, did I slip it into the right chat? Maybe no. Here it goes. Oh, somebody else did.
It looks like Jackie
beat me to it. Thank you, Jackie. Yeah, and I'm excited to read. I'm excited to read them. And listen, I just wanted to add to this conversation about building relationships. Is I really hear you both in terms of non-Indigenous folks having to take up their responsibility, and I see how so many of my Indigenous colleagues are being pulled in so many different directions, and how busy you all can get. And I know what I see from a lot of folks is that they express to me the fact that they feel such a responsibility, and how can they not step up? But it's also unfair if non-Indigenous people don't take up their responsibilities as well, right? This idea of like reconciliation, truth and reconciliation isn't a one-sided thing where it's like, okay, Indigenous people lead the way and that's it. You know what I mean? Like we have to all do our part. And so I just really appreciate what you're both saying. And I think it's okay. Like, I know we say this, I feel like every webinar. So it's that time again, everyone. It's okay to make mistakes, So if I'm sure I've overstepped. I can't think of an example right now, but I'm sure I've overstepped as a non-Indigenous person. And then I reel it back. I listen, I adjust, and or I'll say this: there's moments where I haven't been as brave and as standing up as I should for the work that I should probably be doing. So yeah, it's just this. It's a dance, and it's okay to make mistakes. 7:39. That's our time. That's our usual. It's okay to make mistake time.
Angela, it's so true. The teachers that I work with always talk about being so afraid to make a mistake that's why they sort of hang back. And when I say to them, no, try it, because guess what? I make mistakes too. That's the other thing about it, is that one assumes that the Indigenous person in the school or whatever is not, it knows it all and isn't going to make a mistake. I make mistakes all the time, and I try to be really humble, but also very open about the mistakes I'm making, so that my colleagues who are doing exceptional jobs, because this work is very difficult. We have a million expectations as teachers, and so adding this additional one is difficult. But I think that when you're able to work past it, and we make mistakes when we teach mathematics. We make mistakes when we teach languages and literacy, right? So we can't be expected to be perfect when we bring in Indigenous knowledge, content.
Mm-hmm. Ryan, I'm just going to build on what you're saying. I think what also is important is that as educators, I can speak for myself, is that I model when someone else makes a mistake, if you will. Like, what is a mistake? One of the, let's make a totem pole out of a toilet paper roll situation, right? To not be like, laugh, or to not be like, they're a bad person, because I think sometimes like people will come to me with these cases and they'll wait for my extreme reaction of like, they are so wrong, let's go, but just saying simply like, you know what? I can remember a time when I thought that was probably okay, and I can hear your concerns, and like, let's find a way to talk about it. I have to catch myself, because sometimes people do things where, and I can see myself reacting in a way where I'm like, huh, and then I really remember. Would I maybe 2-3 years ago, was I in the same place? I have to get really humble about my own journey in this as well, and also how much further I have to go as well. And I just want to say, there is so many comments that are popping up around this in our chat. People talking about being supported by principals. I think P stands for principals, from Angela here, saying that she said mistakes are accepted as long as it's coming from good intentions. People talking about examples of times that things have come up, like playing in a teepee. Carrie's talking about, people are feeling our message here, I think. So there's just so much happening. I just wanted to point that out. Ryan, did you want to jump in there? I hear you coming back.
What you said is that you're sort of naming the learning from the mistake and sharing that, because I think that when we're open about this and in the spirit of collaboration, sort of talking about our own learning journeys, I think that also promotes others to take the leap, which is required, so I hope that is happening, and less of the shame and blame.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to say, Ryan, that I think it's so important to really honor when there is a moment that something went really well. As colleagues, if you're able to see another teacher do something and their students respond very positively and feel like the learning was there and they did it in a good way, to sort of give a little, a nudge and say, hey, that went really well. And, maybe I could incorporate that in my teaching. How could I do that? Where did you learn that from? Honoring where they learned it from is also a way of honoring maybe a tradition of teaching that comes from a particular nation. I don't know. So I think it's important to honor the strengths, as well as poking when someone does something like the teepee exercise that turns out to not be so positive, and say, with all due respect, maybe we could shift this or reorient this so that it's more respectful, or maybe take it away altogether. I don't know.
It's about approach too. Like, I think the other thing that kind of scares people away is if they do get shamed and blamed about things like the TP or the totem. But like, what might be a nice thing is, what might work better is this, and you give an example of something else, like making it a more positive kind of suggestion than just saying, you did something wrong, fix it. That does happen, of course. And that's the other thing. When I hear about the good intentions, I'm glad to hear that people are being given that kind of permission to make a mistake if they're coming from a good place. But it doesn't stop there. Like, residential schools, I think some of it people entered into with good intentions. It's about owning when you realize you have made a mistake. And I think sometimes people come forward and they say there's something kind of dodgy about what you're doing, and they just plow on without thinking about, okay, someone's expressed it, and if one person expressed it, there's probably 100 others who haven't said anything. So I think it's about how also do we own up to responsibility after having something pointed out to us. And it's good that we come with good intentions and say, okay, I made a mistake. I was trying to do the right thing, but I made a mistake. But it's also, what do you do after you find out you made a mistake? And there is a responsibility to learn from it. And I think learning from these things is more important than the making of the mistakes.
True enough. And just if any of our participants here are interested, on the chat right now, there's a bunch of really great suggestions coming in for resources, teaching tools. We have Good Minds coming up here. I'm scrolling for a second. 49, what is this one?
49th Teachers looks to be an Instagram account, and I just looked at it, and it's a Canadian Kids Books and Classroom Ready Resources. And looks like there's some nice diversity in the posts they put up. So yeah, thanks for putting that on. The Water Walker was which is about Josephine Mandamin, was put up on that account on March 14th. So there does seem to be some Indigenous books up there. So that's cool.
So maybe we can move to the next question. And that is on the topic of collaborating with Indigenous colleagues. And the question is, what do non-Indigenous educators need to know about collaborating with Indigenous colleagues?
I think, Erica, we might have kind of touched upon this one. I don't know if anybody has anything else to say about it, but I'm just wondering, and I'm just looking at our time, I'm wondering if we should jump to the next series. Sorry, everyone.
A saying that I heard out here that I like a lot, and that is, don't come to the table empty-handed. And they mean that quite literally sometimes, but also it's meant in the sense, like, you can't just go to an Indigenous colleague, say, all right, tell me how to do this. It's more like you should go with an idea of what you want to try and say, this is what I'm thinking about doing in my history class, or this is what I'm thinking about doing with the kids next week. And next week, that's too soon. Ask earlier. But you kind of come with these ideas, and then someone can weigh in on them. But if you come with just like, you do this for me kind of idea, or the whole tokenism thing where I'm not going to have to learn this because I'll just ask the Indigenous teacher to do it or what have you, like, that is so unfair. And so I think in terms of working with colleagues, that's the thing you can do is do some of the work on your own and bring it there for a check. And I think that having the check is a good thing, and you'll be celebrated as much as you'll be criticized. So it's a good relationship to enter into and have, is someone who can be a check on your things. And if they don't know, if they can say, I just don't know, you go ask someone else too. And to be open to that idea that we're not experts on everything. Although I'm sure, Ryan, you've probably been asked sometimes about things like, how should I know that? It's like, well, you're Indigenous, aren't you? You have to know everything.
I think that's such a good point. When folks bring me something that I've already started, it's so much easier. And it also invites me, and I come to that so much more willing, because I can tell that you've already taken the time to do a bit of research yourself. And so I love that suggestion, and I think that's really crucial, because asking us to start from scratch or teach you from nothing is an incredible task, especially when we're teaching our own classes.
Don't have Indigenous colleagues within their own schools. What do you think a good way to access, I guess, the opinions of Indigenous educators might be? How can people go about trying to build those relationships from scratch, really?
Well, earlier you were mentioning Indigenous education resource people. I think a lot of school districts have this, school boards in Toronto and the greater Toronto area. Actually, I think most of them have this kind of a resource person who's probably pretty stretched as it is, but does exist to reach out to if you don't have that in your own school. And out here we have like different I don't know what you call them, I guess Aboriginal education principals that exist in different districts. Or in Victoria, there's the Aboriginal Nations Education Directorate, which is a great resource to go and pick up those kinds of books that have been being shared in the chat. But just they have staff people too who can be asked these kinds of questions. So I still think it's good practice to do the homework yourself before you go. But yeah, in the absence of knowing where to start, that's a good place to start.
Perfect. And I just noticed a note from Tracy here: get out and do things in the community. So an invitation for educators to really start that relationship building not just in a way as a response to, I all of a sudden want to teach about something that is related to Indigenous content. Now I need to go start building relationships, but to actually do that in a more foundational way so that when it comes up, you're already having those relationships embedded in the community.
Couldn't agree more. Because people, I just wanted to jump in and say, I get this a lot from the schools that I work with. They get to that last moment. They're like, oh, we really want to build a relationship for tomorrow. Like literally, we've talked about this, right? So, but it's that long-term piece. It's that, and it's got to be real, genuine, and not about the end goal. That's my biggest learning from being up north and living and working in community, right? It's not about the end goal. There's so much more than that end sort of ask. It's more about the relationship and the putting in the time, and that can be an end in itself.
It doesn't always have to be the Indigenous elder that you're reaching out to. Frankly, our elders have a lot of work to do, and they probably they're overextended. And so I would think about people like local artists, or the grandmothers and grandfathers, or aunties and uncles that exist in your school community already. Because when you're bringing in artists and musicians, they can share with you a little bit of their own craft, but the teachings behind it. And that goes for things as simple as, the uncle that knows how to do things in the bush, or takes his family hunting, trapping, and stuff like that. I think that we have these knowledges. They're existing in our Indigenous families who are in our schools. And I think that's a great community builder. I think that's also a great way to bring those knowledges into our classroom.
Totally. Thank you, Ryan. I feel like we may have time for one more question. We had one come in from Cindy, one of our participants, just asking, our playground design includes teepee structures, and they're quite permanent. How could we have them but use them respectfully?
Gents?
And then are like, you go.
I'm the seller backing away. I'm the seller backing away.
No one can see you anyway.
I'm narrating for you my actions.
That is a tough one. I mean, it's really hard to say without seeing it. I mean, I think I have an idea of what you mean. I've been at playgrounds where they have kind of like sort of like cabins that they can go in, the kids can go inside of, and things like that. But if it's teepees, I don't know that I've seen that kind of thing. I'm kind of curious what that would look like. My main concern with that is whenever you have these like enclosed kinds of structures that kids create these clubs, and they're like exclusive. Like, you can't come in because you're whatever. you're a boy, or because you wear green, or whatever reason it is. And then I don't know, anytime you have those kinds of exclusivities, it's an issue. And I'm kind of more concerned about that than like what it's saying about culture and stuff. I don't know. I mean, I guess making it more explicit is the first thing, and talking about it. It's like, why is it this structure? Why is it a teepee? Who uses teepees? What are they usually used for? And that kind of thing. And then just giving some context to it. I think that's all you could really start with. In terms of using them respectfully, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Naming things that are in the building, and this happens a lot. You know, I'll go into a school and they'll be like, "Oh, I hope you didn't see our problematic mural at the beginning, at the front of our, you know, office. We're hoping that we get it taken down." But the point is, it's there, right? And so we have to talk about it. We have to address it, you know. And so I really appreciate what you're going with that, John Paul.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Indigenous scholars speak to the fact that these are relics of settlers' mistakes. It sort of shows that there is room for improvement. So we can both look at that and say, so what's wrong with that? How did that maybe misrepresent? How did that co-opt the meaning of something that is actually very important to Indigenous people and make it their own? So it could be sort of the stomping ground for some new conversations that are really meaningful. It may be hard to have that with younger kids, but at least amongst the teachers, maybe you could be having that conversation and then bring those teachings to the classroom in a way that's accessible to your students.
Jackie also put a comment in the chat. Maybe, you know, celebrating their, yeah, John Paul, you just put that there. What is great about teepee as a structure design, celebrate this technology that comes from an Indigenous background. Yeah, I mean, there's so much to learn. And I think fourdirectionsteachings.com, and I'll put that in the chat, I think one of the nations that they have teachings from on that site talks about some of the teachings behind the teepee. So that's something that you could bring in as well.
Well, I am conscious of the time here, and I'm not seeing too many more questions coming in, so maybe we'll use the opportunity to wrap up. And I do just want to say thank you. We had a lot of people join us today, actually, about 50 people, and then in the past we've seen more come on and watch it after the fact. So it's nice to know that we're reaching an audience of people who are interested in these topics, and we think they're pretty important too. Ryan, Jean-Paul, and Angela, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge today. I know it won't be the last time that we get to share about these sorts of things, so hopefully we'll see you again. And I'll just put one last plug in that we do have the survey that will pop up at the end for all our participants. We're really hoping to hear from you. And you should keep an eye out for the next webinar. We will have another installment that will come out sometime, I believe, in the fall. So I'll just say thank you and goodbye on that note.
Thanks, Erica, for hosting us, and it was great to talk to everybody today. And thanks, Ryan, for being our special guest. Ryan, is there any, before we sign off, just because this is the first time you're joining us, anything, I just wanted to invite you, you know, any closing thing or anything at all that you wanted to say, plug even?
You know, I just think that because I have been in the school this year and witnessed what is happening and the demands on teachers, I just want to say that when this work is taken up, in a good way, with good intentions, that's really that's the only place in which you can start. And I think that when you're extending those collaborative relationships to the best of your ability within the confines of the school and of your time, I think this is what we got to do. You know, it is a responsibility, but it is also one that requires relationship. And I certainly appreciate it when I see this work being done. because as I mentioned at the beginning, this was lacking from my own experience as a teacher and as a student, pardon me. And so, coming into schools and seeing that there is a change and there's change coming, it is, very inspiring and gives me hope.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, Ryan. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Very nice way to end.
Yeah.
Thank you. It was nice speaking with all of you.
Good to see you.
Nice to see all
again.
your faces.
Yeah.
All right. And John Paul, it was great to see you too. Anything from you today? No pressure.
I was just coming back full circle to that idea of seeing yourself in the classroom. I always think about something that I heard when I was at OISE for the teachers. They would say, the classroom should provide a window out onto the world so that you see the way other people live and the way that things can be. But it should also be a mirror, and you should also be able to see yourself in that classroom. And so if we leave out Indigenous perspectives, we're leaving that out as a window that non-Indigenous people can learn from, but we're leaving it out as a mirror for all of our Indigenous students to take pride in seeing their own histories and achievements represented back to them. And I know it makes a huge difference. The absence of identity and self and knowledge is as strong as a signal as the negativity too. So to see a positive thing represented and to learn actual things about your own people and other Indigenous people, it's so important to your own development as an Indigenous person. So we have to do this for both of those reasons, to provide the mirror, provide the window.
Awesome. Thanks, John Paul. Thanks, Erica. That was awesome.
So welcome. See you again soon, everyone.
Bye. Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.